Hello and welcome to this talk titled What Did Neanderthals Wear on Their Feet? An Experimental Archaeological Investigation of Neanderthal Footwear. My name is Phoebe Baker and I've recently graduated from the University of York with a Masters in Early Prehistory. Since then, Andy Needham and I have been working on an experimental archaeological extension to my dissertation research in early footwear. In this talk, I will share with you some of our preliminary experiments in the area. This research project was very generously funded by EXARC, and so we are particularly excited to be presenting some of our project's first results here with you at the EAC 13 conference. So the question of Middle Paleolithic footwear fits within a broader setting of Middle Paleolithic clothing research, which I'd like to first briefly consider. Unfortunately, for this period, currently no examples of clothing survive. This has severely hampered our understanding of how clothing might have been used, or what it even might have looked like. As such a visual element, depictions or a lack of clothing have played key roles in how we perceive Neanderthals as people, and as such, understanding them properly has twofold importance. So Neanderthals have often been considered the kind of quintessentially cold-adapted species. However, the growing resolution of environmental records, the archaeological record, and our increased understanding of Neanderthal biology and physiology have allowed researchers to begin to question this kind of paradigm. And since the early 2000s, clothing for Neanderthals has become more and more accepted as a survival strategy for the often half Eurasian environments in which they were living in. However, as a field that has developed only really since the early 2000s, much of the discussion has had to centre on establishing fundamentals, such as how much or how little clothing Neanderthals were wearing, and whether they had the cognitive or technological capacity to make tailored, complex clothing like we do, or only very simple cape-like clothing, as we see in more traditional imaginings of cave people. But I now think that we're starting to reach a turning point where we can begin to move past only considering these types of questions. Indeed, footwear fulfills key functional requirements not seen in other aspects of clothing, and I think that we're now at a point where we can consider these within a Neanderthal context. So, how can we actually identify footwear in the Middle Paleolithic record? This was a core part of my master's dissertation, which concentrated on building a theoretical model for this, and as part of this I identified 5 different strands of proxy evidence: environmental, biological, anatomical, based on the foot morphology, the footprint evidence, and the material culture evidence that we currently have from the archaeological record. And whilst in this presentation I'm focusing more on the experimental side of things, briefly, bringing together these varied strands of evidence reveals that Neanderthal use of footwear was probably varied. Looking purely from a thermal point of view, we definitely see some Neanderthals living in really cold extremes at various points, which implies that it's unlikely that they would have been able to survive without any adequate foot protection. Neanderthals are also frequently engaged in activities related to clothing, such as hide processing, which indicates that the creation of footwear is well within their cognitive and technological niche. Finally, whilst I think there are some problems in our interpretation of the skeletal evidence, the conclusion that if Neanderthals used footwear, it likely didn't have a rigid sole, fits within many examples of footwear from ethnographic populations, and I think allows us to start conceptualising what Middle Paleolithic footwear could have looked like. So this brings me on to our main experimental research question: what might Neanderthal footwear have looked like? Because of the massive dearth of primary evidence, answering this question is by nature very difficult and will always be hypothetical rather than factual. So this means that these experiments do not set out to say that this is what Neanderthals were wearing, more that this is something that might have been along the lines of what they might have been wearing if they were wearing footwear. And for these experiments, we focus mainly on creating cold weather thermally protective footwear. Because of the lack of experimental archaeological investigation in the area, we had to start at quite a base level of experimentation, which has involved a significant amount of trial and error. But our approach here was to test both the mechanical ability of each piece of footwear, so this is how well it stood up to actually walking in it, in tandem with its ability to retain heat, so the thermal ability of each piece of footwear. To do this, we designed an experiment where we created a range of footwear designs and then walked outside in them for 30 minutes, taking a range of thermal measurements with an infrared camera at 5-minute intervals. As far as equipment, we decided to use reindeer skins as our base material to create many of these designs. We decided to go with reindeer skins as their bones are well represented at many Neanderthal sites, and their skins are used as key materials in footwear by many existing cold weather indigenous communities. We also purchased some vegetable tanned leather to provide some base comparison, although in the end this wasn't really used very much as it was pretty difficult to work with and we don't have any examples of Neanderthals actually vegetable tanning. We also used stone piercing and cutting tools, which weren't based specifically on any particular examples of Neanderthal tools and were mostly just minimally retouched flakes. We also didn't use any sewing needles as a part of these experiments, as these aren't currently seen in Neanderthal contexts at the moment. Instead, we used a bone awl to pierce holes in the reindeer skins and to pass through leather thongs, which we used as thread. We also finally used an infrared camera, as I mentioned, to take thermal measurements for each design. Overall, we ended up with 6 different footwear designs, which I will share with you over the next few slides. We particularly wanted to explore this question of simple versus complex, and so aimed to test a variety of different footwear configurations, ranging from very simple to fairly complex. Some designs were based on examples from the literature, some on extant indigenous footwear, and some were new designs that we came up with together. So our first footwear configuration was a wrapping of half a reindeer skin around my foot. This was completely unaltered, apart from a few very simple cuts to make it easier to secure onto the foot. The second was a strip of reindeer skin that's approximately about 10 centimetres wide, the whole length of the strip. This was wrapped around the foot, so it overlapped itself all the way down the foot, as you see in the images. Our third was a covering of the sole of the foot. Here on the left we see reindeer skin, and here on the right we see vegetable tanned leather. This was the only example where we used vegetable tanned leather. As I mentioned earlier, it was just really hard to work with and difficult to use as a good analogy for Neanderthal hide-working techniques. These 2 configurations and the one on the previous slide are based on drawings found in Robert Hosfield's 2020 book, The Earliest Europeans, and are the only imaginations of Neanderthal footwear anywhere in the current literature at the moment. Our fourth configuration is a drawstring boot made from a circle of skin with a leather thong threaded through the circumference, which pulled it up into a bag-like shape. Our fifth is the most complex of the individual designs and was made up of a shaped bottom piece and a large tongue for the upper bit, as you see here. This was gathered at the toe, sewn up at the back, and the tongue was sewn on with a bone awl and the leather thongs. And our final configuration was a double boot, in which I wore the tailor boot inside out inside the drawstring boot. From this point onwards in the presentation, I'd like to share and discuss some of our results from these early experiments. We had 2 significant failures as part of the investigation, which interestingly were both the styles that had been suggested in the literature. Style 2 lasted slightly longer than Style 3, but we had problems with both of them. Style 2 just completely separated, and Style 3 was not strong enough, both quickly exposing the sole of the foot. We therefore eliminated these designs from any further testing. The remaining 5 designs all survived until the end of the experimentation. As a wearer, all configurations were generally quite comfortable. The drawstring boot felt probably the least fitted, although it was great once used as an overboot for the double boot configuration here. And I think that we could fix the fit issues by just making the circle a bit smaller next time. The tailored boot was the least bulky and it was also the easiest to walk in, but I was surprised at how easy it was to walk in this bulky half reindeer wrapping, and it would be interesting to repeat the experiment with a wrapping on each foot to further explore this. None of the reindeer skin boots suffered any issues from groundwater, although even though on one of the days the ground was relatively wet. And we did see the vegetable tanned leather get very soggy, which became eventually quite uncomfortable to walk in. So it was nice to see what a difference it made having the fur on the skin. Using the thermal camera also allowed us to begin to identify weak points within each design. A common weak point which allowed heat leaching were the points where the bindings pulled the fabric closer to the foot. So this really shortened the pocket of warm air surrounding the foot, and we saw a similar effect with the seams in tailored designs. Although these were less of a problem than I had expected, as the reindeer fur did a really good job of filling the holes in between where the leather thong and the holes where the leather thong went in and out of the skin. An additional area of weakness for many of the footwear configurations was the sole of the foot. This was kind of expected, as this part of the footwear is the only part which has consistent contact with the ground, and so is the only part of footwear being consistently pushed up into the foot. So this also gets rid of that pocket of warm air, similarly to the bindings. Also, because of its contact with the ground, we expect the sole of the shoe to be one of the first areas to start to wear away with extended use. Which brings me on nicely to a brief discussion of these preliminary results. Tailoring is actually relatively easy, even with the most basic of tools that we were using, which made many of these footwear designs not only applicable to the Middle Paleolithic Neanderthals that we're specifically looking at here, but also potentially to earlier hominins that might have required clothing too, as I know now are also starting to be considered in the literature as well. The tools that we use here are certainly an underrepresentation of the more complex tools which we know that Neanderthals were certainly able to create, which has implications for both our theoretical modelling and for our understanding of the archaeological record itself. Additionally, whilst I think that Neanderthals had the technological capacity to create complex garments, these experiments showed that even really very simple designs actually worked fairly well. And I think this starts to challenge the narrative that simple clothing is necessarily worse than complex clothing. Lastly, testing mechanics and thermal properties together here have been really interesting, and the appearance of thermal pressure points raise interesting questions about how or whether Neanderthals might have innovated their footwear to cope with these types of pressure points. Additional features to increase the insulative distance between the foot and the outside world could have been added, such as packing, and also features to add protection to the sole of the footwear, perhaps in the form of bark or tar. Now to conclude with our final slide, I wanted to highlight a few of our current study's weak points and hint a bit at our future plans. As I mentioned earlier in the paper, because of the small number of experiments in the area, we've had to start at a really baseline level. By testing the mechanics and thermal properties together in an actualistic setting outdoors, we were unable to control enough variables such as air temperature and foot temperature to have fully quantifiable results at this point. This means that we are currently unable to make comparisons between the different types of footwear to say which is actually better from a thermal point of view. To achieve more quantifiable data in the future, we're planning to take the footwear designs which were successful in the actualistic setting and test them in a more controlled lab-based environment. This, we hope, will enable us to examine which type of footwear would have been actually best from a thermal point of view. So thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure to share some of our experiments so far, and we'd like to say a massive thank you to EXARC for your very generous funding, to the Year Centre where we were able to do our experiments, and a big thank you to everyone at the University of York Department of Archaeology for your wonderful support.